Alok Sharma, thanks so much for joining 7:30 tonight.
Laura, pleasure to be on.
I wonder if you felt any sense of déjà vu watching the proceedings in Dubai and the tussle over whether fossil fuels should be phased down, phased out, or, as was eventually agreed, transitioned away from.
Well, Laura, look, I think we did make some significant progress at COP28, and as you've just shown, for the first time in any COP, in 26 COPs, we managed to get language on phase down of coal in Glasgow, and on this occasion to transition away from fossil fuels in the energy system. But look, I was very keen, as were many countries, and particularly those most climate vulnerable countries, to ensure that there was language, very clear language on phase out of fossil fuels. That isn't where we got to. Nevertheless, I do think if countries stick to the commitments that they've made, we are heralding the end of the fossil fuel era. But you know, as I said in Glasgow, and I repeat again, these agreements that are made, these international agreements, are literally words on a page. They only have meaning if countries actually follow through in terms of domestic policy what they've agreed to internationally.
Beyond the fossil fuel wording, and I understand what you're saying about the compromises there, what has COP28 achieved more broadly? There was a lot of other measures that were agreed on at the summit in Dubai.
Yeah, so I think you saw some commitments on finance, you saw commitments on money to support countries, the most climate vulnerable countries, with the loss and damage that has taken place. One of the areas that I think I would have liked to see more progress is on finance, and I think that was a view of many climate vulnerable countries as well. The reality is that if we're going to transition to a net zero global economy, that is going to require trillions of dollars. And that support has to come not just actually from developed nations, but also from the private sector. There is a lot of work going on that, but we need to accelerate that. So I hope one of the things that we will focus on in the coming year and at future COPs is ensuring that we get more finance to support the most climate vulnerable nations.
As a former president of COP, can you explain what that process is like? I mean, what happens in those negotiations when you're trying to find common ground amongst 200 countries?
Well, it's an incredibly frustrating process. You know, I've been at the epicenter of that at COP26 and then COP27 as well in Sharm el-Sheikh. And this is a consensus-based process. And the reality is that this is very much like playing a game of Jenga, which many families will be doing over Christmas. You know, if you remove one block, if one country walks away, the whole thing can collapse. And so inevitably, you end up with a consensus, and you know, not everyone is happy with absolutely everything that's agreed, but nevertheless, we have been moving the world forward. So if you think back, Laura, before the Paris Agreement came to force, the scientists were telling us we were heading towards 4 degrees of global warming. After Paris, it was 3 degrees, and if all the commitments that have been made, including net zero commitments by countries, we're heading to below 2 degrees of global warming. But the reality is that unless countries are willing to accelerate, we will blow through that 1.5 degree target that was agreed in Paris and reiterated in Glasgow.
Have the dynamics of the meetings changed in recent years as smaller countries who are, you know, existentially threatened by climate change demanded to be heard more loudly?
Yes, so I think you know, the COPs are one of those few times when the most climate vulnerable countries will sit face to face and be able to look the biggest emitters, the biggest economies in the eye, and have that very clear discussion and hold them to account. And you know, at every COP there is a reckoning. At COP29, the most climate vulnerable countries, the world, will look back and see what was actually achieved by the promises that were made by particularly the biggest emitters. And it comes down to a matter of trust. That's what this process is based on, trust in the multilateral system. So, you know, let's see where we get to at COP29. The other thing I would say, Laura, which I think has been a positive addition to these COP processes, is that at COP26, for the very first time, we had the business community arrive in some force to make their own sort of detailed commitments on energy transition, on zero-emission vehicles, and we've seen an acceleration in those areas. And again, we had representation of the business community at COP28 in a significant way. And if we're going to get to a net zero world, it requires countries, governments, it requires the business community and civil society working together and effectively singing from the same hymn sheet.
You mentioned that we've been able to get down below 2%, apparently, and you were widely credited at Glasgow with keeping alive the prospect of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. In 2023, is that target beyond reach? You mentioned those commitments that people will have to give in at COP29 and COP30. How optimistic are you that those commitments will be able to be signed off by 2025?
Yeah, so look, I said in Glasgow that 1.5 degrees was on life support, and we had a fragile win, and I'm afraid that remains the case. As you've said, 2023 is the hottest year on record. We see the impacts of climate change around us. You in Australia are experiencing this right now in parts of the country, and there is a very real danger that we will lose 1.5 degrees as a target unless countries are willing to act with more urgency. Laura, I'm a glass half full person. I believe we will get to a net zero global economy and all the positive benefits, not just for the environment, but also the economy in terms of jobs and investment. We will get there. The question is, will we get there fast enough to avoid the worst impacts of climate change? And we've heard from some of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world, some of them represented in the Pacific, that if we were to get to a 2-degree world, that would literally be a death sentence for very many millions of people. And that's why it is so important that particularly the biggest emitters act over this year and they ensure that they are keeping to the commitments that they've made at COP28.
A major loophole in the Dubai Agreement was seen to be concessions on so-called low carbon transition fuels, in other words, gas. And that's a particular issue in Australia, that it's sort of seen as a fossil fuel that isn't a fossil fuel. What should be done about gas?
Look, I think this is an issue about transitioning to a clean energy economy globally. One of the things that was agreed at COP28 was for countries to agree to triple global renewables capacity by 2030. I mean, Australia is in a place to be an energy superpower in the region to help fuel decarbonisation across the world, and I know that there's been some progress on that. But ultimately, we have to recognise that if we're going to keep that 1.5 degree target in line, the world needs to cut emissions by over 40% by 2030. And that does require us to address the issue of fossil fuels production as well as usage. And that's something that I think we will want to see countries ensuring, as well as, of course, expanding significantly their renewables capacity.
Well, as you mentioned, Australia has re-engaged in this process much more aggressively in the last couple of years, but we're also opening new coal and gas projects, as is happening in the UK. Does that have to stop?
Well, you're right, Australia has engaged, and in fact, the Australian government and Minister Chris Bowen were incredibly supportive of the UK at COP27, and I know he played a really important role at COP28 as well. Every country has to look at its energy mix. You start from a different position. As I understand it, the government has recently said that you are on target to cut emissions by 42% by 2030. But every country has to look at its energy mix. How can they meet those targets that they've got in terms of cutting emissions? One of the other areas, Laura, that countries did agree to act on was to end inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And so let me give you a sort of UK example, is that for every £100 in the UK that is invested by the oil and gas sector, they get £91 back from the taxpayer. And the question I'm asking the government here in the UK is that how is it efficient to give a £91 subsidy on every £100 back to fossil fuel companies here in the UK, because that may well be leading to projects that would not otherwise be commercially viable being rolled out. And I think this is an issue for every country in terms of looking at the subsidies that go into fossil fuels.
Big questions indeed. Thank you so much for your time tonight, Sir Alok Sharma.
Thank you.